Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from Command Central at the Philanthropy Mastermind series, brought to you by our friends at DonorSearch. And as you may have heard me say before, we won't be talking much about DonorSearch today, but don't leave. It just means that they have been our very generous and faithful sponsor since 2016, where we can have conversations with leaders in the field of fundraising and philanthropy and social good. We're doing that again today with Brian Becker, who's been a guest in the podcast in the past, and we'll be talking with him today about boards, which he knows a great deal about. And so if you want to learn more about DonorSearch and maybe your donors, and I hope you do, you can learn all about them as well as more about this series over at the DonorSearch site, which is at donorsearch.net. And under the resources tab, you'll find a whole area for the Philanthropy Mastermind series, as well as now a whole bunch of social media channels. So if you do like to follow what we do, I hope you'll go ahead and sign up for those. Before we get underway today, I want to welcome you, of course, and encourage you to participate in the conversation because it will be about, once again, boards. And as Brian said, as we thought about titling this, igniting the powder keg. And so is that just inflammatory? I doubt it. It's a little bit explosive to try and get people who may not be always on the same page with you to do what you need them to do. But there's a lot of pent-up opportunity with those leaders if we can just find a way to tap into it. So we'll be talking about that today. But if there's a chill in the air, it may be the same one that I'm looking at out my window where it is freezing. So I'd love to know, and I'm sure our guests would like to know, where you are tuning in from today, and if it's as cold in your office as it is where I am. So please feel free to just say hi. Tell us where you're coming here from today and maybe what it's like in your part of the world. I'm also going to ask you throughout about your relationship with boards, and I'm sure Brian will have those questions for you too. So, Laura, thank you for warming up the chat. Washington, D.C., yes, it is frigid. I'm in Northern Virginia, so I know what you mean. And we don't do well with snow around here, do we? So, Deborah, thank you. North Carolina, very cold, yes. Maybe a little warmer than here, but probably not much. Plymouth, Mass. Oh, wow. Okay, you win. You win so far. We've got west of Chicago. No, I think they beat you. And then, a balmy 27 degrees in Haverhill, Mass. Okay, so it looks like we've got New Jersey in the 20s. Appleton, Wisconsin, 7 degrees. Well, if this is a contest, you win. Northwest Arkansas. Boy, we were just talking about, we were talking about Nebraska, not Arkansas, a minute ago. 20 degrees here in Cleveland, Ontario, Canada. Oh boy, I'm sure you've got a story to tell. Thank you for telling us what it's like in your neck of the woods. I hope that chill doesn't extend to your board and to your office and the relations between the two. But in Fort Worth, 53 degrees. I'm tempted to just tell you to leave because I have no sympathy. But I know that in Texas, 53 is a real deal. So do stick around. I appreciate you. So Brian, finally, I want to introduce you. I'm sorry for keeping you in the wings as we commiserated about the weather. Brian, I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'd love you to just say hello. For those who don't know your work, you are, of course, a consultant, executive leadership coach, an author. You've worked extensively with not-for-profit organizations, especially at that leadership level. We were talking about a bit about that before we began today. You're also an author. That's how we first got to know each other through your book, Tender Lions, which is a wonderful book about that father-son relationship. And you've got probably a book in the wings, but I won't say anything about that. I'll leave that to you to talk about. But let's just start by saying hello and how are you doing?
Hi, well, great to be here. Thanks, Jay, for providing the forum, and thanks to DonorSearch for doing this over and over and over again to provide all kinds of great resources. And I've participated in this, and I've been a beneficiary of watching many of them over the last couple of years. So thank you. And I'm pleased to be here. Yes, you've captured well what I do. For a little more than 17 years, I've been self-employed as a consultant and executive coach, mainly to nonprofits on planning, strategy, board development, fundraising, culture improvement. Before that, for about 17 years, I worked for several very large nonprofits, and I wasn't a CEO, but I was a director and a vice president and a senior vice president, and spent a lot of time on helping to grow organizations, grow new programs within them, grow ministries within faith-based organizations, and working with boards and fundraising, had my own donor portfolio for a long time. So I've been in the seat where many of the people from Appleton and Arkansas and Cleveland are. I've also really been privileged in recent years to serve on some boards. And so I have a whole new perspective rather than consulting to them, but like, oh, I'm sitting in the chair of one of the board members. And so now how do I serve well there? And so I've been particularly interested in how do you ignite the powder keg. Yes, that is what we're calling this. And I'm working on a book, and that may end up being the title of the book. And it came from a friend of mine who's a retired senior exec who went into a coffee shop and ran into a young woman who he knew, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm the new executive director at this little nonprofit." And he goes, "Oh yeah, I heard about that." And she said, "I feel like I'm sitting on a powder keg. There are all these people around the table who are talented, experienced, some of them very wealthy, they have connections, they have influence." And she said, "I inherited a board that just sat and listened to reports, and they're really disengaged. How can I ignite, how can I light the fuse on all of this talent?"
That's but now as a board member too, I'm sure you've seen the opposite of that, the people who think that they're in there and pushing the board, but the board's not doing anything. This is something we hear. And I'm sure from the board member's perspective, you're wondering how do I light up the staff?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Uh,
Oh, yes, there is some of that. And generally, executive directors would rather that boards not think about how to light up the staff because that
Right.
that dips down into the weeds. And
Yeah.
to be most effective, what executive directors tend to need is for the boards to stay on that strategic generative space to help them think about direction and vision and culture and connections and steady streams of funding and all of that. And then stay what I call on the rails and out of the weeds. So, by the way, people are welcome to chime in with questions
Yes.
during our time together. I want to. I mean, there are many things one can do to ignite the board, but I'd like to talk about just maybe 4 ideas. And so people are welcome to chime in at any time with their own questions. And I would like to talk about and conversation with you, Jay, and those online about how to engage them, effective ways to recruit, their basic fiduciary responsibilities, and then how do you create under that a real spirit of generosity. And I work with a framework all the time called appreciative inquiry. And if you're not familiar with that, it'd be worth doing a little bit of research, all of you, not right now, around appreciative inquiry and how that's a really life-giving possibility seeking approach to dealing with boards in the organization.
And I'm sure you can touch on that a little bit as you
Sure.
go through. So
Sure.
you have these 4 big things you're going to introduce to us, and I know you have
Sure.
some slides to share. But once again,
Yeah.
I just want to echo what you said. If you see anything out there that Brian is talking about, you want to participate in that actively, we're going to be watching both the chat and the Q&A throughout, and we'll try to make sure we tackle those as they come in. And if we end up with a bunch more questions or comments, then we can tackle any particular moment. We'll make sure to save those to the end too. So please don't be shy.
Yeah, Jay, let me just add, if right now you're sitting out there in Cleveland or Ontario and you're thinking, gosh, I hope that Brian talks about this one thing, what would be the one thing that would make this really valuable for you? Give us a question or a topic, and we'll make sure that we work around that. Okay.
Perfect.
So, yeah.
Well, Brian,
okay,
to take it away.
Let me share a couple of slides, and I'm got to make sure that I'm in the right place here. Share screen. There we go. It should come up.
Yes,
you should see a slide that says appreciative inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So appreciative inquiry is a process, not theory. It's a process that people follow, a mindset that people follow that really has 4 stages. And what's important about using appreciative inquiry is that you ask a great question to get started, because the mind will go where the question leads it. And so the topic today is about how do we create a highly effective board of directors, one that ignites the power keg. And there's 4 stages of this. And it's not like you're going to sit down with your board of directors and ask them 4 different questions, but rather this is a process or an underlying premise that you work with that helps keep the board in a healthy mind space. And the first one is that you want to be in a discovery space. Curiosity is one of the key elements for keeping boards engaged and in a generative space. And so, for example, working with one client relatively new, we spent the first couple months doing surveys of people, finding out of their stakeholders, finding out what they care about, what the strengths, what the limitations are, because the board needs to be extremely well informed if they're going to move into a space of planning, strategic planning, that's setting goals, that sort of thing. So, and to be in the appreciative space, carefully crafted questions are really important. For example, a local school board discovered that there were a lot of fights happening near and around the school. It just so happened that a committee of the board was coming in for some meetings, and they happened to witness one of these all-out brawls of a bunch of junior high guys. And of course, that was very upsetting to them. The next board meeting, one of the first questions that got asked was, well, why are those kids always getting in those kinds of fights? And that just drilled down into a lot of negative conversation about kids nowadays and where are the parents and that sort of thing. So the question of why are those kids always getting in fights is not a question that has any type of appreciative approach to it. What if they step back, took a breath, and asked a question like, how could we as the board create an environment and a culture where everyone would show up on time every day, ready to learn? Now think about the difference between where your mind goes, why are those kids always getting in fights, versus how could we create a culture that creates an environment where everyone shows up on time, ready to learn? And your mind goes into a completely different space that way. One is very negative and drilling down into problem solving, and the other is very generative and what I call above the line, curious and seeking life and taking risk and that type of thing. So asking the right kinds of questions and being curious is really important. What that does is it helps you create a very accurate picture of your reality. May not be positive, but it's reality. Second thing is, well, if we know where we are, what do we want it to look like? Where do we want to be? And so this is really important in helping boards, always looking forward, always looking forward. What might it be like? We look for possibilities, we look for potential, look for energy, you look for what you love about the organization. So you create a really clear shared vision of where you want the organization to move. Third thing is, well, if you know where you are and you know what you want it to look like, well, what are the steps that can begin the process and movement in that direction? And I have to say that every single organization I've consulted with over the years where they've really gotten themselves into this appreciative mindset, they've discovered that most of the resources they needed were within their grasp. They just hadn't been looking in the right way. And so to get yourself in the right mindset is the majority of the game, because if you're in the right mindset, asking the right questions, the connections, the dollars, the people, the resources tend to unfold. And then what happens when you have this ideal picture of where you want to go, and you begin to have conversations about designing a strategy to get there, you get progress in the right direction. And then this becomes a sort of an undercurrent of appreciative thinking, generous thinking, abundance type of thinking. So that's the first thing around engagement. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second here. Someone asked, how might a director influence a growth mindset when historically the organization is engaged in binary and report-based meeting? So let me read it again. How might a director influence a growth mindset, the board, when historically the organization is engaged in a binary and report-based meeting? So binary as in sort of black, white, yes, no, report-based meeting. In that situation, I believe that the partnership between the board chair and the director, CEO, whatever that person's called, and how they design board agendas is really vital, that you you can try to scrap the part of that, oh, we come in and we make reports and you listen to reports and then we rubber stamp them, because then the board meetings are boring. And you're not utilizing all of that. And pretty soon people feel like they're wasting their time. And so recreation of agendas. I had a client, university in Texas, where the new president of the university had a board that was used to just listening to reports and strange governance structure. And he said he began designing really appreciative types of questions to build into the agenda that would keep them in the strategic mode, keep them in a generative mode, asking them questions that help bring out the skills and experiences and the connections that they had. He said that was part one. He said part two was he would do work on their suggestions between meetings, touch base with them, and then come back to those next meetings and say, Susan, you mentioned connecting with such and such an organization. Well, I followed the track on that, and here's what we've learned about that. So he's affirming their generative conversation and validating that he's using what they're giving him. It doesn't mean that he had to do everything that they asked him to do, but that began to build momentum and got them out of the reporting and problem-solving mode. So let me add another piece to that. Colleen, I think, asked that question. When you have a room full of influential people who want to do good, but they're not given the right kinds of questions, they'll problem solve. They'll dig right into the tactics. They'll get right into the weeds, which may make your life even more and more difficult. And so by asking them the right kinds of questions and directing them into the strategic area away from tactics and nitty gritty, they'll be more engaged in a healthy way, and it'll be easier for you. It's still hard to wrangle the board, but at least if you're wrangling them into the strategic area and out of the weeds, it's going to be a much better life for you and for them. There's also, as it relates to engagement, which is my first point, this what I call the rubber band effect, which is when you're in the meeting and having good discussions, it's as if this rubber band pulls everybody in the board together, and you feel very, strong sense of cohesion and alignment, which is critical for strong culture. And as soon as the meeting ends, the rubber band begins to stretch. Now, you as the CEO, you keep doing the work, but they can sometimes emotionally and psychologically, they stay back there where they were in the previous board meeting. So what can you do between those meetings to keep the rubber band effect, keeping people tight? So how do you take their ideas, stay in touch with them periodically through email, through text, through a coffee, through a newsletter, through a phone call, because it's so easy for them to completely forget about you between meetings. And it's a very rare board member who's going to stay in touch with you often between board meetings. And so if you could put some disciplined systems into place that remind them that you're there and you're thinking about them and you need their thoughts and their input, that will help that rubber band effect. So that's a bit of information about engagement. Also, really clear expectations when you're recruiting can solve a lot of those problems, because if you bring someone on and them really not knowing how they're going to be successful as a new board member, they don't know what to do and how to act. So in the recruiting, which is the second thing I want to talk about, how you recruit and creating clear expectations is a really, really important part of strengthening the board and giving the new board member clarity about what it is they can do to be a successful board member. So Jay, should I move on to point two, talking about recruiting?
Sure, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, all right. And
Thanks again, Colleen. Yeah.
I'll count on you to watch the clock, because I can go all day long with it. So I'll go back to my slide here. So some of you, if you're younger than me, you may not remember, but there was a great movie maybe 20 years ago called The Right Stuff, and it was about recruiting and training astronauts. And when you're training an astronaut, you don't go down to the mall and say, hey, who wants to be an astronaut? and let people just come and sign up. It's very rigorous, very strenuous, and the lens gets tighter and tighter and tighter to get into the program. And I think that a lot of organizations, when they recruit, you know, I've not seen any correlation between like a size and scale of an organization and how sophisticated the board is in their approach to recruiting. Some of them, it's sort of like, who do we know? Who has a pulse? Who will say yes? It's sort of like the local school where they're recruiting room parents. And when I was a kid, they called them room moms because they were all moms at that time. And that doesn't get you a stronger organization. It just gets you a bunch of volunteers. And so in the recruiting process, I like to look for something that doesn't just get you a strong board, but it gets you a strong board and a strong pipeline of people to potentially be on the board. And so with my clients, we do the organizations where I'm on the board. If I can encourage the board to do that, we do what we call a deep bench approach. That's an athletic term, you know, like you don't just have your 5 starters on the basketball team, you have your 5 starters plus 7 others that you can call on, and they're all capable of playing a certain role. So how do you go about doing that? It's not to sit around the table and say, who do we know? I'm going to give you 3 quick phrases, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on each of those, okay? So first is, don't start with who do you know, start with what do you need? What does the board need most next in order to strengthen the board? So you have to assess the strengths and the limitations of the board. Once you assess the what, then you go to the who, because by really defining the what, it's like, again, refining the lens and getting a tighter and tighter focus on the type of people that you're looking for. And then you use your what I call the relentless pursuit of the right stuff. And you go about doing that by being prepared and sending the very best people to recruit the new board member or board members. And I put 2 up there because I think it's most important to have 2 people. You don't have to do it this way, but I think it's better to have 2 people go on those meetings, whether it's Zoom or in person. I always prefer to do it in person if I can. By the way, if it's ideal to not ask them to join the board in the first meeting. The first meeting is more like courting. It's like, hey, we'd like to meet with you, Susan or Fred, and we want to talk to you about our organization. And your name came to us as somebody who maybe would really appreciate and enjoy being involved with the organization, provide value, and we'd just like to have a conversation about that. So you have this initial conversation, and if you can also give a tour of if it's a place where maybe you have youth services or something like that, or you could have people come and see the organization in person, see how it operates. That could be most important to do that. So I'm going to go to some like deep tactical stuff here now, okay? So this is just a blank spreadsheet, and you'll notice that across the top of the spreadsheet, it has some descriptive words. This is taken from an organization that I'm familiar with, where they're looking for, this is how they got that what part, what, who, how. So the what part was, we want people who are artistic, they're connected, they're alumni, they're generous, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And their board had a conversation and defined these 8 or so characteristics. Then the next thing was like, well, what do we need most next? So if you were thinking, hey, this is really cool, I'd like to use this, don't use our words here. Have your board or a task force of your board develop your own words that you're looking for. Maybe it's some sort of expertise in mental health issues or athletics or youth development or whatever it might be. And so you start with, what are you looking for to be on the board? So then I'm going to flip to another chart here. This is a list. The names I made up, but the chart is actually from an organization that I'm familiar with. And by the way, these are not their board members. These are their potential board members. And this is all held in confidence just by the CEO and the current board members. So they're having first a discussion, not about the names, but they're first having a discussion about what kind of people are we looking for? And they say, oh, here's the kind of people that we're looking for. Then they're like, okay, well, who in the community, or in community could be all the way across the state or all the way across the country, depending on your organization. Who are the people that are those thought leaders, those wealthy people, those connected people, those influencers, those thought leaders that we'd love to have. And so they may not even have a connection to the organization yet. And so this organization now has a deep bench of about 15 people that they would potentially someday ask to be on the board. So you think, well, okay, so we have this list, but they don't even know that they're on our list. So you start to woo them. Maybe you have an annual event. Well, make sure you invite every one of those people to the annual event. Maybe you have a golf outing. Maybe you have a walkathon. Maybe you have a volunteer day, special mailings, insiders mailings. And so these people get treated in that special way to try to draw them closer to the organization. And then you get a test and say, oh, Bob is really coming closer to the organization. Oh, Erica, she is not warming up to us at all. So you know who to leave on the list, who to drop off. And from that, when someone turns out of the board, then you're like, oh, okay, Tim Tappendorf, he's the next guy. He's the guy that we're going to go after. So this always gives you a pipeline of people, and it assures that the people that are coming onto the board already are the kind of people that you're looking for. This is a lot like professional baseball or hockey, where they have their pro team and then they have their farm club, where, you know, they don't wait until the catcher throws his arm out to look for another catcher. They've got 5 or 6 other people already in the pipeline that they know could come in. So that's the deep bench approach to recruiting. One other thing before I leave the recruiting part of this is, this is a chart. I know it's a lot of information, but this is a chart that just keeps track of how long your current board members are on the board. This is assuming that they have term limits, okay? This particular organization, you can see like the blue bar is 4 years long. The brown bar is 4 years long. So we know that Susan Anderson it's 2024. She's in her 3rd year of her board service in the 2nd term, and that she'll be on the board for another 2 years. So this is important just to keep track of, oh, next year we have to recruit 2 people or 3 people. It's also important to continue to keep eye on the gifts and skills of these people. I've seen it happen where, oh, 2 people are rolling off the board, and then they discover that those 2 people are giving 75% of the board's giving, and they hadn't really thought about how to keep them in the fold, so to speak, in order to make sure that they have a, you know, steady stream of income or whatever. So just as another tail end of keeping track of the whole recruiting process. I'm gonna go back to the, okay, no more questions at the moment, all right?
Not right yet, but
Okay.
you know, Brian, one thing I would like, as you jump into the next section here, I'd be interested to know if the people in the room are using something like this matrix in their own organizations, and maybe what kinds of things are in yours, if you have one, that you didn't see in the one that Brian just shared with us. This is something I've seen in other organizations as well. And so I'm always curious to know, do we use something like this? If we do, what characteristics are important to you? So if you want to list anything like that or share it in the chat or the Q&A, we'd love that. Brian, please go ahead.
Yeah. So to tag on to that before I go on to the other point, most of what makes the board really strong isn't rocket science. It's not complicated. It's discipline systems. The best that I see in my clients and the boards that I have served on, we just do certain things that are really important to keeping us focused on strategy, building the board, making sure that the resources are there for the organization to run well. And you calendar that in, like, you know, twice a year, we're going to review the strategic plan and make sure we're on track there. We're going to review our deep bench list twice a year. We're going to make sure that those people are all getting a thank you calls from board members if they make a gift or if they attend an event. So Leslie says that they track their trustees' tabs in Excel. So it's not complicated, but somebody has to tend to that and keep bringing that in front of the board. Good. All right. Well, we'll keep an eye on the chat, and I'm gonna move on to talking about fiduciary responsibilities, which sounds really boring. But it's actually, I guess if you approach it a certain way, I guess it could be boring. But if you approach it in another way, it creates really, really healthy conversation for the board. So I think I've been on 6 or 7 boards in the last 25 years. And I was probably into board service about 10 years before someone said something about, well, as your fiduciary responsibility as a board member. And I said, what do you mean fiduciary responsibility? I said, I know that word fiduciary, but what's that have to do about me and my volunteerism here with this organization? In those first 10 years of being on different boards, no one had ever brought that up. I didn't know that I had a legal a responsibility to the organization, and there was a responsibility and a risk involved there. I thought I was just volunteering to do good things for organizations that I cared about, which I was. But there's a lot more to it than that. And if you help the board see that there are certain things that they need to tend to, it also helps them stay in an area that's very appreciative, generative, positive, forward-looking. And there are 3 of these fiduciary responsibilities. By the way, if this is new to you and important to you, every single lawyer that I've ever met said that they had to be trained on this when they went through law school. So you could bring in, maybe you have a lawyer on your board, they could do some orientation around this in more detail, because I'm only going to cover this from a mile-high view. The first of the 3, one is duty of loyalty. And so as a board member and collectively as a board, we have to make sure that all of our decisions serve to advance the mission of the organization, and only in the best interest of that organization. So the mission that says, we exist to do this, to serve this population, or to accomplish these outcomes. No self-interest or another organization. You have to disclose your COI, conflict of interest. Just recently became aware of someone that I'm doing some work for, that they have a board member that sits on another board, which isn't a problem, except that this organization would really like to acquire this organization. And there's a lot of tension between those 2 organizations. So as a board member, I'm thinking, how can you serve the interest of both organizations when they're like competing interests? And it just seems like a real conflict of interest to me. And I've recommended to them that they ask that person to resign from one of those boards, because I don't know that if I were in that position, I could be loyal to both organizations. They're not bad organizations, but they're just very different. And so duty of loyalty first and foremost to the organization. Second thing is duty of responsibility. The state government, the federal government has things in place that every 501c3 is supposed to do. Not supposed to do, you have to do. For example, if you have a budget over a certain size, you file your 990 every year. Approving budgets and evaluating your CEO and creating a strategic plan and monitoring that strategic plan and assuring that there are resources there for that plan. And you have your own bylaws. You have a stated mission. And so to do work that promotes that, is responsible for that, cares for that, is really vital. Conversation like that with the board keeps them in the strategic generative space. And last, equally as important as the other 2, is duty of care. And that means that as a board member and collectively the board cares for the assets of the organization. So it's easy to see the physical assets. Maybe you own a building, or maybe you have to take kids to parks, and so you have station wagons or vehicles, or you have computers or cooking equipment or basketballs or whatever. That's all important, that you care for that. But also, there's the reputation of the organization, how people see the organization, the culture within the organization, caring for the people and the goodwill of the people that are there. And so the conversations that the boards have about duty of loyalty, duty of responsibility, and duty of care are very important. And if this is a brand new concept, to have an attorney do some board orientation on what does that really mean on the ground for the board, I would say would be really a advisable thing to do. Most organizations that really are caring and maybe not even knowing about this, they are doing these things, but it'd be a good idea to make sure that you're clear on what it is, as really important conversations for board members to have. Lastly, I want to talk a bit about generosity and abundance. And again, this is a mindset that comes right back to the appreciative inquiry mindset. I ran into this little image probably 20 years ago, and it keeps popping up for me now and then. Festina lente, strange image, a rabbit coming out of the shell of a snail. And if you know your Latin, it basically means make haste slowly. So go fast, but go slow. So it's very paradoxical. And so as a board member and a leader in a nonprofit, I want the organization to have a sense of urgency, to let our donors, our stakeholders, and particularly the people that we serve, I want them to know that we care about them and we're going to work. One of my own corporate values for my own company is work. We believe that work and a good day's work is really important. And so we want them to know that we care about them, and we're going to work to be a good partner with them, to walk alongside them, to do that work in a really quality way. And so there's a sense of urgency and passion and assertiveness, and you can feel that like we're pressing on the gas pedal. And this is the paradoxical part. We need to, at times, say, we're going to stop. Right now, we're going to stop. We're going to pause. And we want to reflect, and we want to learn, and want to be curious, and we want to listen, and make sure that as we make these really life-changing, life-giving types of decisions, that we're doing it wisely. And trust that the universe or God or whatever is going to provide the resources that are needed for us to be able to do this wisely. And so that's a mindset. There's a lot that one, I don't mean to be harping on the media or whatever, like don't watch the news because that's a horrible thing. But there's a lot of zero-sum game thinking that comes through in reporting and political reporting and politics in general about I've got one pie, and if I give you a piece of my pie, then there's not going to be enough pie left for everybody else. When I'm sort of like, well, why didn't you think about not making a pie? Why didn't you think about making 10 pies? And somebody well, I won't have enough ingredients for 10 pies. Say, well, I don't really think that's how the universe works. You might want us to think that, but I grew up on a farm, and at the end of every harvest season, this is oversimplifying it, okay? But you could take the ear of corn that was left on the ground and just put it on the shelf and leave it there for a year or 2 years or even 10 years. As long as that ear of corn is on the shelf, in a dry place, in a cool place, it'll just stay there. And it looks like it's dead. But as soon as I plant that kernel of corn in the ground and give it the right type of care and the right type of sunshine and the right type of moisture, it will produce itself 10 times over, 100 times over, 1,000 times over. And it was all in that kernel. It looked like it was dead. It was not. It was a miraculous thing. And by staying in the appreciative inquiry space, looking for life, looking for pus, asking questions that help people continually point for the life and the connections and the resources, you find them. You find them. I'm going to put a slide up here that has way too many words on it, but by the way, this will all be available later. This was, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or so, I started doing a lot of thinking about my own clients and the ones that I approached, and they were really in the zero-sum mindset versus in an abundant mindset. And I could hear it in the language they use. I heard the zero-sum organizations talking like, well, we're trying to get them to give to us. We're trying to get them, we're trying to get the gift. Well, if we don't do that, then that can't happen. Well, you raise money and we do program. So they saw themselves in silos versus we strive to help our donors feel a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. We help them give through us, not to us. Being on our board isn't hard work. Being on our board is interesting and challenging and a pleasure and fun and meaningful. And donors aren't like a means to an end. The donors are an integral part of the whole process, just as meaningful as the staff, just as meaningful as the people that we serve. And so this is a mindset that turns into a language and a way of doing things. Those who are struggling with this, you could look at Dan Pallotta's TED Talk that's been watched probably 20 million times 10 years ago. And it's just been turned into a movie called Uncharitable, which presents, I think, in a really powerful way, the story that how nonprofits need to tell their story about their value to the community and why it's important that people are supporting what they do. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there and come back to Colleen asked a question or made a comment here. Another skill that could be tracked is context expertise. Context expertise. Colleen, can you share a little bit more about content? Okay, thank you. Okay. Content expertise. Yeah. So for example, if you're working with youth, if you have people that have great, yes. Okay, great. Good. Jay, I've been rambling for like 15 minutes here. So question.
I was wrapped. I mean, you had me throughout here, and it's interesting because we had a comment also from someone else who just asked it in the form of a question. I've answered, now it's gone, talking about how much they were enjoying this because they frankly didn't know what to expect from the session. But by taking us through everything from the chart all the way through to this whole idea about generosity, and this concept of appreciative inquiry, it was very helpful to that person. I know it's helpful for me to always reorient and rethink, which begs a question, which is that all of us, I think, get into this mode. I think we were talking about it before we started today, where sometimes we find ourselves, as you put it earlier, below the line. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It might be momentary. We sure hope it is. But what are the things we need to do to kind of drag ourselves up above the line? And maybe you can revisit what that refers to, above and below the line, and how that relates to what you just shared, and how we can keep ourselves in the right place.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, it's a great question. If you have not seen out there, all you good listeners, a short little video, it's like 3 minutes long, and it's called Above and Below the Line. It may be called location, or if you Googled location above and below the line, it'll pop up. And basically, the above the line person or organization is curious, loves humor, is not risk averse, knows that you cannot find a creative or innovative space without taking risk, and the willingness to let yourself go there, willing to collaborate, willingness to be wrong for the sake of the better way. That's above the line. The below the line person is going to be quick to judge, intractable, very risk averse, and oftentimes to the detriment of themselves and the organization by saying, I'd rather be right than change. And so now we're all both. we can be both.
Mhm.
And so here's another thing that relates, because this is about brain chemistry as well. Our brains want status quo. We were not wired for risk and fun, and our brains are wired for status quo and safety. And 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 so it's a rare person that gets up every morning and says, "Hey, how do I change my organization?" And so we realize that becomes a conscious choice, and it's a practice that we get into. It's just like if you've never exercised and then you want to do a 5K in 6 months. Well, you can't wait 4 months and 3 weeks to get into shape. But what I mentioned one phrase about 10 minutes ago, and that's discipline systems. These successful nonprofits, highly effective boards, the CEOs and the staff around them, they put discipline systems into place, just like the runner who's not run and wants to run. You put discipline systems into place around recruiting, around smart agendas, asking the right kinds of questions, making sure that the conversations always come back to vision, values, beliefs, goals, really using the board members' connections and experiences. So at the end of the meeting, they're like, they asked me what I bring. You know, they join that board maybe for personal interest because they want to make connections and move up the ladder. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as their primary motive is, I want to help move this organization forward and advance this organization and this cause. And it's not brain surgery, it's discipline systems, oftentimes kind of boring things that help us to move the organization forward.
But discipline doesn't mean inflexibility either. I mean, at least that's the way I'm hearing you.
No, not at all. But as an example, I was working with a fine arts organization in the Chicagoland area, 50-year-old organization. The organization's programmatic area had way outgrown the strength of the board, and the board became up listening to reports and rubber stamping things, and they knew that they were lame, and they had a very large funder that said, if you don't improve the quality of your board, you'll never grow beyond them, and we're going to stop funding you. And they actually disbanded the entire board.
Whoa.
They changed their bylaws to go from 18 down to 3. And they went out to the community and talked to community foundation and funders and said, we're looking for 3 people who will help us reinvent the board. And their purpose will be to build, and they really ticked off about a third of their board. The others were like, we get it. We're lame. We're not doing any good. A couple of them got really, really angry, but that's okay. You have to be very disruptive if you want to like do a clean sweep like that. And then I came in as consultant right after that. But that first year, those 3 new people really worked to reach into the community to tell their story about how, hey, this is a really important organization. It serves 1,000 kids a week who live in poverty around fine arts. And we're looking for people who really can help us. And they created a really smart, small recruitment package. See, this is the discipline system part. Very specific expectations. Here's what we want to accomplish. And here will be your role as like a generation 2 board to take us to a generation 3 board. And it was transformational for the organization in many ways. So took the executive director a tremendous amount of courage to go to some of her most long-standing board members. They didn't have discipline systems. They didn't have term limits. The board meetings it was like Groundhog's Day from one meeting to the next. And so if you're willing to put those discipline systems in place, now that particular board has a board calendar. They meet every other month, and each month there's just a couple of things that they know they need to do: recruit, strategic plan, conflict of interest forms, recruit, approve the executive director's salary and evaluation and all of that. And that they're really clicking now. So
Brian, and I want to make sure we, in our last few minutes, if anyone has
Yeah.
a question or a comment, please post it here. I have one final one myself, and then I want to remind everyone that a recording of this is being made, that you will receive an email with a link to it so you can share it with colleagues. If somebody needs to talk about blowing up the current board, well, at least they'll have a way to discuss that. You can just share this with them, but also a copy of the slides. Is that right, Brian, that you'll be willing to share those? So we'll make sure that you have that. That'll come through to your email. So please be on the lookout for that. But I did want to ask you, when it comes to the thing that many of us in the room think about, which is the money, how we can make sure that we take the things you've been discussing and also apply them to that task of making sure that the board members are truly empowered and enthusiastic and seeing a world of abundance, right? The right side of the line that you presented in that last slide before the rabbit coming out of the shell. That the idea that, no, there's really more opportunity out here. And that probably starts with the individuals on the board themselves and perhaps with the staff too. Can you just talk about that for just a second? Because the people in this room will always be thinking about, how can I make sure that I meet the goal? And it seemed like you laid out how, in the end, this isn't a problem of not enough and I've got to get things, but rather there's a world out there of opportunity if we just tune into the right messages, if we ask the right questions.
Yeah, great question. I believe that this starts with the board chair and the CEO being in lockstep around intentional conversation, messages, designing agendas that always point towards the life, the energy, the potential, the importance of meeting that mission. And the board chair being willing to step forward ahead of the CEO on occasion and saying, hey, everybody, let's say that there's not a healthy giving within the board, and that person, he or she stepping forward and being willing to say, this is how I'm going to make my commitment good this year, whether that's time or connections or dollars, and then continually encouraging the board to step. And sometimes, like growing the garden, it takes a couple of years to transition that culture to one of real generosity. But you can wreck the spirit of generosity in one meeting. It's like you can kill your garden all at one time. But it takes years to develop the really healthy garden. And so stay with it in how you act, how you support the mission and the vision, the values, and how the language you use is really important. Telling stories about why people are doing what they're doing be really, really convincing. So,
yeah. Well, I think one of the many things that I'm going to take away from this is, if I just keep that ear of corn on the shelf and I keep it dry, I might be able to grow something I never anticipated. It might be 1,000 times the size of each kernel.
But you have to be willing to plant it. You have to be willing to plant,
Thank you. Absolutely true.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, Brian. Really do appreciate your coming back. I want to encourage everybody to, again, be on the lookout for the email. And would you mind putting up the slide again where people can find out more about you and your work and reach out to you if they want?
Absolutely.
And then I want to also just let everybody know that if you haven't heard Brian's episode of the Philanthropy Masterminds series podcast, it is available to you on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, Podbean, etc. You can take a look for it there. I hope you'll enjoy it, along with all the other podcasts and sessions we have. And we have more coming up next week, 2 more sessions in addition to another podcast, and one just dropped with Robert Ager, who is the founder of DC Central Kitchen. Lots of great stuff. Really do appreciate, especially you, Brian, and everything you shared with us both back then and your personal story, as well as all this wonderful information on strategy and tactics and everything in between today. Really do appreciate you. And thank you, everybody, for hanging out with us today. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Until then, stay warm. Take care. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you so much.